Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Dean Cole and Notre Dame, for hosting this amazing summit. It's a very important topic. We are the last panel, so we have the joy of being the last panel. And I'm very excited about this panel. We have an amazing group of panelists. I'm just going to introduce them very briefly, and then they will give a presentation of their own explaining what the Black church and religious freedom means. And then I'll ask them a question, pose a few questions to the panel, and then we'll leave time for you all to ask questions if you have any questions. All right, I'll go in the order that they will give their presentation, starting first with Bishop David Daniels III. He is a professor of church history at McCormick Theological Seminary. He has authored various articles on the history of Christianity, as well as book reviews. He serves on the editorial committee of a New History of World Christianity project that's funded by Orbis Press. Bishop Daniels has lectured at various colleges and seminaries throughout the United States, as well as internationally. He has been an ordained minister in the Church of God in Christ since 1980. He holds a PhD in church history from Union Theological Seminary and a Master's of Divinity from Yale University, as well as where he was the Benjamin E. Mays Fellow for the Fund for Theological Education. After Bishop Daniels, there is Dr. Jacqueline Rivers. She is the Executive Director and Senior Fellow for Social Science and Policy at the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies. She has served as a lecturer in both sociology and African American studies at Harvard University. She has presented at Princeton University, University of Pennsylvania, Stanford, the United Nations, and the Vatican. Her publications include The Paradox of the Black Church and Religious Freedom, which is a chapter in the volume of Not Just Good, but Beautiful. She holds a PhD from Harvard University, where she was a doctoral fellow in multidisciplinary program in inequality and social policy of the JFK Kennedy School of Government and a graduate research fellow of the National Science Foundation. She also holds her undergrad and master's from Harvard as well. After Dr. Rivers, there is Reverend Dr. David Latimore. He serves as the director of the Betsey Stockton Center for Black Church Studies at Princeton Theological Seminary. He has over 20 years of experience serving congregations in various cities that include Nashville, New Orleans, Durham, and others. Dr. Latimore has faithfully served his community, providing leadership to several organizations, including as a founding member of African American Clergy Coalition, former chaplain of the River Valley Juvenile Detention Center, and chair of a local chapter of the Black Chamber of Commerce. Dr. Latimore holds a PhD in theology from the University of Chicago Divinity School and a doctorate of ministry and homiletics from McCormick Theological Seminary. He has his undergraduate degree from Harvard University and master's from Duke Divinity School. And lastly, but surely not least, we have Tim Schultz. He is the president of the First Amendment Partnership. He works with faith groups to ensure that religious freedom is fully protected in the law. He chairs a broad and diverse religious coalition aimed at influencing federal policy and public opinion about the value of faith and common good. He is a graduate of Kansas State University and Georgetown University School of Law. And with that, we will start with Bishop Daniels.
I'd like to thank Dr. Rivers and Dean Cole and others for inviting me to be part of the panel today. My presentation is a historical one. I'm an historian. I'm an historian, and so you can see my key question is, what does the civil rights movement's philosophy of nonviolence teach us about depolarizing today's battles over religious liberty today? Next slide, please. Oh, I guess I can click it. And so this question is one where I'd like us to focus on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I'd like us, I think, to come up with a new narrative about the role of the nexus between religious liberty and race. The quote is from James Melvin Washington that says, "The founders of the Black church movement were strong believers in religious freedom. They were black folk I can't see that far. I should have brought my printed out. But they were black folk who are affirming what they believe to be the natural God-given right to freedom. But this was not a notion of freedom without responsibility. Souls had to be saved, brothers and sisters in bondage had to be liberated, and churches had to be organized and built. Again, the question is, what does the civil rights movement's philosophy of nonviolence teach us about depolarizing today's battles over religious liberty? So I want to make 5 bold claims, which is my historical component here. The first one is that the flip side of the civil rights movement's struggle for racial justice for African Americans was the religious liberty clash between religious liberties of white segregationists and the religious liberties of African American Christians. And I'm not sure this has been pursued in the religious liberty conversation, but it has been pursued within the history of the civil rights conversation. Stephen Haynes did. There's a book called Mississippi Praying. There's another text dealing with the Methodists in South Carolina. In addition to sit-ins to segregated lunch counters, which we know a lot about, civil rights activists are unsuccessful in integrating segregated churches and youth rallies, especially Stephen Haynes' work shows that in Memphis. The third claim is as the campaigns of civil rights movements engage in dismantling the reigning segregationist racial code order and erecting an emerging interracial order, they brokered a new national coalition of racial justice around a group of people that include Christians, Jews, non-religious, who then constituted this new consensus around racial justice. The fourth claim is that religion, in addition to race and sex being legislated as protective class group in the Civil Rights Act 1964, that this registers the religious elements of the civil rights movement. You recall that all the other civil rights acts, including the one that was being proposed by President Kennedy, basically focused on race. Sometimes they include color. And they included national origin. It's only, as I understand it, but I'm not a lawyer, nor am I a historian of the Civil Rights Acts. When we got to the 1964 Act with Lyndon Baines Johnson, was religion added. The fifth claim, that the philosophy then of the civil rights movements played a role then in depolarizing the clash between the competing religious liberty rights of the constituencies of others, of citizens and Christians. So if this is true then possibly we should be looking at the civil rights movement and then the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a place to talk about religious liberty in the nexus between race and religious liberty. Again, my question again. Oh, I'm sorry. The question now says, during the civil rights movement, is there a nexus of religious liberty and race? And again, I'm proposing it because the religious liberty rights of white segregationists and the religious liberty rights of African Americans. If there is this nexus, then my next question is, was race, my question really is, was race depoliticized is my question, while religious liberty was not the subject of civil rights for African Americans. So in this nexus then, do you depoliticize race by including race, national origin, color, sex, and religion, therefore spreading the conversation? Now looking at King's, 5 of King's 6 points. So the first one is that it needs to be a way of life. King is very clear that if you're engaging in nonviolence, that is not merely a method or tactic. So my question would be, if you're engaging in depolarization, must it be a way of life or must it be a strategy or tactic or method? The second one is, as people know, the goal is not retaliation. The goal is redemption. You're now bringing in religious language that's there. The third one is that you don't demonize, dehumanize your so-called opponents. The fourth one is that you realize, and again, the whole horror of Bloody Sunday, the burning of churches, the girls that were burned at Birmingham, 16th Street Baptist Church. People will die, possibly, in this campaign to depolarize. But you're not doing it for suffering's sake. There's a movement towards redemption and change. And then lastly, love needs to be what the response is and never hate. So, as you know, really earlier than 54, there's this majority. But I want to call what King calls in Letter Birmingham Jail moderates. I want to call them desegregation gradualists. Because they were very clear. They were not against integration. It's just they thought desegregation needed to wait for a while. And you can tell then, they are the changing group in the coalition. They go from the Plessy versus Ferguson inauguration of segregation being the gradualists, along with white segregationists and eventually black separatists. King, as you know, lifted up the Nation of Islam as black separatists, putting him on the side of white segregationists. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964, not dismissing the strong arming of Lyndon Baines Johnson, clearly looking at the National Conference of Religion and Race being a key factor of mobilizing not only Christians and Jews, but also Orthodox and others, that he, others, the role of the National Conference, then created a new consensus and a new majority. And in that, the gradualists, so-called moderates, switch over to then join the white integrationists and the black integrationists to help pass the legislation, but also create this new consensus for the nation, which in this case then, if it's true, depoliticize race in order to depolarize then religious liberty. If then this nexus between religious liberty and race did exist during the Civil Rights Movement, was race then depolarized, while religious liberty was not even necessarily a subject. I mean, I did a Google search, I looked through King's speeches. Religious liberty is assumed, but it's not stated explicitly. There's some other places that are, but the actual thing on the ground is there. In the religious liberty and race nexus, then was race depolarized by the Civil Rights Movement, by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, by the legislation then including as protected categories. Again, I'm not a historian of Civil Rights Act, and I'm not a historian of religious liberty in that sense, but my understanding is this is the first time that religion is a protected category within the legislation, outside of the First Amendment, along with color, national origins, and sex. So then, what does the Civil Rights Movement's philosophy of nonviolence teach us about depolarizing today's battles over religious liberty? And maybe then, the narrative needs to expand, and the nexus between religious liberty and race needs to be probed. Thank you.
So I also want to thank Dean Cole and Stephanie Barkley and Mia, who did all of the groundwork. Oh, I didn't know that I had a PowerPoint. So I'm not sure how closely this matches what I want to say, so I shall use it sparingly. Yeah, so we'll just leave it there. So the first thing is, everybody knows, we know that this is a really polarized society at the moment. And it's really political polarization. So I know that Tom pointed out in his book, Tom Berg, that over 80% of respondents in one poll were to some extent in agreement that the leaders of the opposing party posed a threat to democracy. And in another poll, it showed that between 1978 and 2006, the number of, that the distance that people had in their approval rating between how they approved their own party and the opposing party, that doubled. So the disapproval gap doubled, right, over the course of about 40 years. In addition to that, Tom Edsall, in his book, Point of No Return, argues that lots of issues that were not politicized became politicized as we became more and more polarized. And that the fact that these things, like religion, are now so politicized actually makes it harder to address polarization. I want to just give two very obvious examples. First, I want to acknowledge that when Beckett Law does its annual Religious Freedom Index, they consistently find pretty high levels of support for religious freedom. But I want to suggest that that is kind of religious freedom in the abstract. And that there's a lot of support, and Beckett does document this, for minority religions. But that I think there's a lot more critical appraisal given to Christianity, which is seen as more of a dominant, oppressive force in the country, and in particular, if you're talking about white evangelicals. So, despite the fact that there are these, in theory, high levels of support for religious freedom, what's happening on the ground, and I think Dean Cole talked about this last night, is that as we are winning in the courts, as religious freedom advocates are winning in the courts, we are generating cultural backlash. We need to win hearts as well as minds. And that's where I think that the Black church can really play an important role, because we are seen as having been ourselves subjected to severe discrimination, injustice, and oppression. If we are coming out in support of religious freedom, then I think that does a lot for the cause. I just want to talk a little bit about the data, just a couple of examples, about how there's this split between the parties on SOGI, that is sexual and gender identity issues, and on racial justice. So the Congressional Progressive Caucus has a progressive promise, which has an entire agenda item about tackling systems of oppression and dismantling structural racism and discrimination. That's not something that Republicans are getting on board with. The Democratic Party platform says Democrats stand with the LGBT community's fight for equality. That's not something that Republicans are getting on board with. So there's a sense in which Democrats are lining up on one side of these issues, Republicans on the other. A 2018 Public Religion and Research Institute poll found that Democrats are almost twice as likely to have interacted with an individual with a different sexual orientation than theirs than are Republicans. And it was also they were also much less likely than Republicans to be disturbed by their child's having a transgender spouse. The gap in support for racial equality that this survey found was also large. Only 29% of Republicans would prefer that the United States, 29% of Republicans would prefer that the United States be ethnically and racially diverse. Democrats, it was a much larger percentage looking for ethnic and racial diversity, 65%. And Democrats were much more likely to say that racial diversity makes the country stronger than Republicans were. So what I want to suggest is that some of the tension, and I think this is not discussed among advocates of religious freedom, some of this tension, and Tom Edsall says it, race has a big role to play in the polarization in the country. And that's true around religious freedom as much as it is around these other issues. This kind of union between, in the Democratic Party and among Democrats, between race and these social and gender identity issues creates a kind of safeguard for black churches. So even where black churches are not necessarily on board with gender identity issues or homosexual, gay marriage, we're given a pass because we're black, right? We're given a pass. Nobody's going to come hunting for us. We're not the first people they're going to take to court over these issues because we're black. That gives us all the more power to stand up for religious freedom, to stand up and say people ought to have the right to take a different position than the mainstream position on these issues. But we're not motivated to do that because we get a pass. Having us involved would really increase the moral standing of the religious freedom battle and would be we are in a position to challenge the idea that allowing people to follow their conscience is actually discrimination. We are the ones who can push back against that. But in addition to the fact that we aren't motivated because we get a pass, in addition to that, tell you the truth, most black people don't want to be identified with the people who are standing up for religious freedom. And I see my sisters back there giving me the nod. Most black people don't want to be identified with the advocates for religious freedom because, and I guess I have a slightly different take on the history than Bishop Daniels did, because conservative Christians have been identified with racial oppression and racial discrimination for centuries. So if you think about slavery, Christians were the ones making the argument for slavery on the basis of the Bible. The Hamitic curse, which was completely twisted and taken out of, I would like to say that my Jewish friends were actually the origin, apparently, according to David Bryan Davis, of this idea of the Hamitic curse. But white Christians here in the United States lapped it up. The idea that black people are cursed by Noah in the book of Genesis, and that's why we're slaves. Now, first of all, Noah didn't even curse Ham. Second of all, we're not descended from Ham, according to the Bible. So it's completely twisted, but that was the basis on which, one of the many bases on which slavery was defended in the antebellum South. In addition, the Joint Baptist Committee, and I know that we have representatives here in the room, their Committee on Public Affairs used religious freedom. So for a long time, so the Baptist Church splits over slavery into the Southern Baptist and the Northern Baptist, because the Northern Baptist was like, if you're a slaveholder, you can't be a bishop, you can't be a missionary, and the Southern Baptist like, oh, we're good to go. We're not going to deny any rights to slaveholders. We're not with you on that. In fact, we are so not with you on that, we will split, okay? However, just prior to the Civil Rights Movement, Baptist churches, black Baptist churches, were now beginning to join the Joint Baptist Committee, and they come on board and they're saying, well, racial justice is really an issue that Baptists ought to be standing up on. And the committee pushes back and says, no, religious freedom is where we take our stance. We're not going to touch racial justice. So religious freedom is actually used as a way to deflect concerns about racial justice. And of course, white Southerners were defending this racist social order as being God-given. God created us this way. White men are supposed to be in charge. White men. Furthermore, Bishop Daniels talked about King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Clearly, lots of white Christians did not get on board. The whole point of the letter is because these white pastors not only failed to get involved with the civil rights movement, but they actually write a letter decrying the civil rights movement. Oops, I only have 5 minutes left. So if you guys ask me questions, I'll get to the rest of my 5-hour-long presentation. But I promise I won't go on for 5 hours right now. But it's not just a history. Same thing is happening right now. White evangelical support for Trump is outstanding. In March of 2024, Trump had a 67% favorable rating among white evangelicals. Maybe you support Trump. But what I want to say here is it differs from, first, the rest of the country, and second, the black church. So he has a 30% very favorable rating among white Christians. It's a 60% unfavorable rating among US adults, 80% unfavorable among black Christians. There's a big split here where race is really tied up with this issue around religious freedom. And then Christian nationalism, my sister was talking about that yesterday. The idea that white Christians should be privileged in national life, and that in fact, if you're not white and a Christian, you're not really an American, and that they are ready to use violence to protect that position. Clearly, race is central to much of what is going on here. And the work of Robert P. Jones, the founder of Public Religion Research Institute, finds that mainline Protestants and Catholics are nearly twice as likely as unaffiliated whites to say that the killings of black men by police are isolated incidents rather than part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans. We should be the justice people. White Christians should be the justice people. Black Christians should be the justice people. We should be the ones in the streets. We were not the ones leading the George Floyd protests. Furthermore, these white Christians are 30 percentage points more likely to say that monuments to Confederate soldiers are symbols of Southern pride rather than symbols of racism. They're 20 percentage points more likely to disagree with the statement that generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for blacks to work their way out of the lower class. And white Christians scored higher on the racism scale in Jones' study. Evangelical Protestants had the highest median score, 0.78, on his racism index. But he says it's not just white evangelicals. And this, I think, took me aback. I know white evangelicals, sorry, my brothers and sisters, are out there on the racism index, but white Catholics did not come in far behind them, 0.72 on his scale. White mainline Protestants, 0.69. And the general population was 0.57. White Christians are more racist on his scale than the general population, and more racist than unaffiliated Americans. Their score on his scale was only 0.42. The church is supposed to be in the vanguard for justice, for racial justice, and instead, we are the tail end. We are the most racist of them all. So I want to suggest that one way for the white church to bring the black church in to the fight for racial justice is to really take on the issue of racial justice. If the white church wants us to get involved with religious freedom, if the white church wants a black church involved with religious freedom, the white church needs to take more of a position in defense of racial justice. I don't want discrimination against white people, but there are issues of racial justice that have not been addressed. And I had another hour to go on and talk about residential segregation, which is the most egregious of the issues and which still has tremendous impact in black communities. But since I've run out of time, ask me about it later in questions if anyone would like me to talk about that some more.
Good afternoon, and I echo the gratitude of my colleagues in extending to Dean Cole and everyone who is a part of this gathering. So grateful for the invitation and the opportunity to participate in this discourse, and clearly always blessed by having the chance to hear from Bishop Daniels and Dr. Rivers on this important topic. I serve at Princeton Theological Seminary. I run the Center for Black Church Studies, so my life, my work, and my resource is grounded in the practicality and concreteness of the church. And so that is the vantage point from which I enter into this important conversation. And so I asked the question, what role might the Black church play in mitigating, minimizing, impacting, influencing the growing polarization that we see around these issues of religious liberty, and what might be the impediments to that kind of collaboration around an issue that I subsequently found that there was great commonality of thought. I examined several of there's a gentleman by the name of Scott Thuma who's over at Hartford International. He does a tremendous amount of work on quantifying characteristics about the church writ large. And he has a subset of researchers, some of whom look specifically at the Black church. While they don't ask the question around religious liberty outright or directly, they raise a number of questions around the core concepts that we often reference when we're talking about religious liberty. Issues of freedom of beliefs and non-discrimination and separation of church and state and so forth and so on. And what he finds is that there are tremendous numbers, and quite frankly, in this latest batch of research, probably somewhere around 70 to 72% of African-American religious communities that sign off wholeheartedly on the concepts that represent religious liberty, right? That there is not unanimity, but there is a shared commitment to the experience of religious liberty, which raises then the question, then why don't we see more of the church actively engaged in these issues? And I think some of the reason for that is really related to, in spite of the intellectual agreement that may exist between the Black church and representatives of religious liberty efforts that don't fall into the Black church, and I immediately remind myself I need to add a asterisk. When I say Black church, I'm talking as though it is a monolithic institution. It obviously is not. It carries great religious diversity of practice, of intellectual and theological thought. But when I refer to Black church, I'm trying to pull at the themes that can be found in large segments of the church. And the agreement or the acceptance of issues of religious liberty and the way in which it is woven into the DNA of the Black church and its historical experience is really pretty profound. And Dr. Rivers has written on this, and several other scholars have articulated the ways in which forms of religious liberty lie at the heart of the very birth of the Black church. That it was, in part, the desire to be able to worship, to participate in worship led by one's community and one's leaders, to express oneself religiously, giving full breadth to both African religious traditions and the amalgamation that was occurring during the early history of African slaves here in America, that there was a desire to worship freely. And so from that, in every ensuing historical period, we find that vibrant instinct toward the appreciation, the embrace, and the celebration of the acquisition of religious liberty and what it might mean for the community. So there's great intellectual agreement. The challenge for us, however, is there is conceptual and, as I was talking to the other Dr. Rivers at lunch, and linguistic dissidence that enters into this discourse and creates meaningful variance in how the African American church interacts with these discourses on religious liberty. I want to just comment on the conceptual element because I've not spent enough time. This came into our conversation earlier today, but it's really worthy of consideration. But there is conceptual dissidence because for the African American church, the importance is not simply the aspirational goal of achieving measures of religious liberty, but there is an instrumental goal also embedded in that. Now, I have an uncle who has a deuce and a quarter in his garage. And for those who might not be familiar with that, that's the old electric 225 that he's been restoring. It's a beautiful car, but he has it up on cinder blocks. And I often ask him, well, when are you going to get tires for this thing? And he said, well, I may get that someday, but I just love walking in here and seeing it. For some, there are conceptions of religious liberty that seem to be thought of in similar fashion, that here's an aspirational goal that we ought to all be behind, but the African American church is going to ask the important second question, to what end? Mm-hmm. What is the instrumental good that we're after in the approach, in the celebration, or the fight for religious liberties? Woven within the DNA of the African American church, and again, I want to be respectful of the variants, but there has always been a discourse around not just liberty, but freedom, right? The ability for the enslaved, the ability for the oppressed, the ability for the least of us to have some experience of life here in this place that allowed them to engage in the full citizenry and the full benefits of their participation in American society. And so when we think of religious liberty, we think of religious liberty as the religious pursuit of liberty, that the ways in which our religious practices ought to be affirmed and allowed, and those religious practices can often be directed toward the achievement of, again, some material or some earthly experience of liberation. Not everyone thinks that way. There are plenty of diverse opinions on this. But this is a pretty significant theme that we see emerge at several historical periods and in the contemporary church. And it is around these issues of the material experience of liberty and the way in which the pursuit of that is often informed by our religious instincts and the ability to engage freely in that pursuit that creates problems in this conversation. Because there is the perception that when religious liberty is tied to material liberty, when religion is used for the uplift of the impoverished, when there is material consequence to the work that we're doing, then our partners across the aisle step back. And this is a little bit of what Dr. Rivers was just mentioning. And so it leaves for us a puzzling question. Then, if your religious liberty does not produce liberty for all of the human community, what good is it? So some of the reticence and some of the hesitation, I think, emerges from this conceptual understanding of what it is that the black church is really after. The black church is after, and again, for the third time, plenty of diversity, right? So I don't want y'all to go and find a black pastor who disagrees with me, because you can find them. But there are significant portions of the African American church for whom, particularly in this contemporary moment, where the economic viability of African Americans within communities seems more fraught with danger and tension now than ever before. And we've gone through several periods where we've seen the ways in which oppression has expressed itself within the African American community, or that African Americans have been subject to oppression. But in this period, maybe because of the technology, maybe because of the discourses we're having, it seems even more evident to us that there is something at risk for the African American community. And we want to know that those individuals who proclaim the pursuit of religious liberty also include within it the liberation of people who are oppressed and are using their religion or understanding their religion or interpreting their theological positions or their practices as allowed under the umbrella of religious liberty to advance the well-being of all. And if not, then it will remain the case that you will have difficulty incorporating communities for whom oppression is a lived reality into the pursuit of these intellectual and aspirational goals, meaningful as they are, that don't yield material change in their lives. There is equally an important role for the African American community and the black church to think more deeply and more critically around whether or not we understand religious liberty when extended beyond our borders. So there is a place for growth and development of our own theological thought, but the primary impediment to us is this dissidence that exists from a conceptual level. And then finally, again, I think the language doesn't help us. As we were saying, we talk in terms of freedom, not liberty, right? The language of liberty seems to imply that the agency or exercise of the agency of the individual has been constrained in some way. So I'm not at liberty to do certain things. Maybe one way of thinking about it. Within the African American church, it's about freedom, because we've not even arrived at the point where we have a recognition of our agency, much less the exercise of that agency in pursuit of liberty. And there will be some who could take issue with that, but I think that's one of the places where the rhetoric doesn't help us, and also the conceptual elements that we're dealing with create other problems for us as it relates to unifying around these issues. So I'll stop there. I'm grateful for the comments of my colleagues, because they have informed even my own thinking today, and appreciative of this time with you.
Well, I want to first thank Dean Cole, the law school here, Professor Barkley, and say what an honor it is to be here among my fellow panelists. My job, my day job, is to work with different religious groups around the United States on the legislative politics of religious freedom. So I think that's why I'm on the panel. I'm here to connect that issue to the rest of the discussion. And so, in the great tradition of Bishop Daniels, I have 5 observations that we didn't even consult. And you're going to say, wow, did they consult? Because it turns out they overlap in some significant ways. So the first thing is, my first observation is, the black church demonstrates what religious freedom is for. When I'm a lawyer, I'm trained as a lawyer, when I'm at legal conferences like this, I tend to think, and the prism people tend to look at seems to be religious freedom as a kind of a legal issue, as legal victories, as the developments in the law. And that's all really important. If you talk to people who run ministries or run churches, they care about that stuff too. But what they really care about is the right to be themselves and bring their full selves into the public square. And they care about the right to serve. And they do that in ways that massively subsidize the common good. So scholars like John DiIulio, Ram Kannan at the University of Pennsylvania have referred to this effect as an invisible hand of social welfare. They talk about the fact that congregations provide social welfare in ways that we haven't even really begun to fully measure, and probably the best current estimate of this was done about 8 years ago by a scholar named Dr. Brian Grimm, who found that faith-based institutions give about $1.2 trillion of annual valuation to the United States. And a lot of that is coming out of congregations. And guess who does that pound for pound better than anybody else? It's black churches, right? So if in my county where I live, Prince George County, Maryland, which is a majority black county, probably the most effective social welfare provider in the county is certainly not the Prince George County government. It is First Baptist Church of Glenarden, the largest church in Prince George County, pastored by Pastor John Jenkins Sr., okay? And they're not just there to benefit their members, they're benefiting the entire county by their existence. Now here's the thing, if that went away, as my friend Reverend Dr. Eugene Rivers likes to say, the secular cavalry ain't coming, right? They're not coming. So the black church shows what religious liberty is for. It is about the right to serve, and it subsidizes the common good, even if you're suspicious of all this religious freedom talk, even if you're secular, even if you're not religious yourself. Religious groups, the black church and others, are really subsidizing the common good. That's my first point. Okay, point number 2. The black church experience debunks a common religious freedom myth. On the political right, you'll often hear the story of religious freedom told as something like this. Look, America's like a religious freedom Garden of Eden, and then it was corrupted by secularists and progressives, okay? something like that. Variations of this story are told at banquets and fundraisers all the time. The black church experience in the King years absolutely debunks that. Now, as Bishop Daniels says, this wasn't the primary focus of Martin Luther King Jr.'s discussions of his speeches, but what do you call it when black churches are bombed and, you know, the authorities don't really investigate? What do you talk about the rampant violence against people organizing civic meetings in black churches that go unpunished, you know, looking the other way like pro wrestling referees, right? State-sanctioned violence or quasi-state sanctioned violence against the church. It doesn't get any more of a religious freedom deprivation than that. Now, part of the reason we don't talk about it as a religious freedom deprivation is because there were such more egregious human rights violations happening that the religious freedom piece of it was just kind of a small piece of the pie. But it was a piece of the pie. In fact, if you compare it to any other religious freedom deprivation in sort of the edge of my lifetime, I can only go back to 72, but it's the worst deprivation of religious freedom in the United States in sort of living memory. And it's just really important to remember that the black church knows what it is to have its religious freedom violated, and we know that the government is capable of that kind of evil toward our citizens. Really important to remember that, okay? Third point, the black church demonstrates the political coding of religious freedom. What do I mean by that? This is going to intersect with the point Dr. Rivers made a few minutes ago. You go to religious freedom events, okay? This is a notable exception, but if you just go to all of the religious freedom events, you'll always kind of say, you know, why is the black church perspective seem to be a little underrepresented here, right? Little. Now, little, you know, to be charitable a little. Now, one reason for that is the existence of the reality of white supremacy, okay? Now, I just said those words, and for those of you who know me, you're just sort of shaking your heads. Yeah, that makes sense. But others who have never met me probably assume I'm a pretty left-wing progressive because the term white supremacy in the United States has become coded for being a kind of progressive term, coded. You get what I mean by coded? You hear somebody say that, you're like, I know where you are. Mm-hmm. But in fact, white supremacy as a subject has been discussed far longer than its co-option by modern secular progressives, right? I mean, the term goes way back as a diagnostic summary term for a thing that really happens in culture and beyond the culture, right? Okay, but my point is, when you say the words religious freedom to the average person in their culture, they view that as right-coded. So when I introduce myself and it says, what do you do for a living? I try to size them up, and I sort of, if I know they're conservative, I sort of say, I work on the behalf of religious freedom, okay? But if I detect that they're progressive, I use a slightly different formulation. I talk about free exercise rights, religious accommodations. You see what I'm saying? Right, and the reason is because religious freedom has become right-coded. Now, if you care about religious freedom, as I do, that should concern you. And you ought to spend a lot of time thinking about how to depolarize that coding. Because if in the long term, the coding of religious freedom is right-coded, we're a polarized country, as Dr. Rivers has expertly laid out. You don't want half the country to hate something that's really important to you, okay? All right. Fourth point, the black church offers a model of sober and realistic political engagement. At the urging of Reverend Dr. Rivers and Dr. Rivers, a few years ago, I read the 3-volume work by Taylor Branch called Parting the Waters. Pulitzer Prize winning. If you want to spend 28 hours reading about the civil rights movement, I couldn't put it down. It's amazing, okay? But here's the thing you realize about the black church's interaction with sort of the powers and principalities during the King years. I mean, everybody had dirty hands, right? Lyndon Johnson, dirty hands. The Kennedys, oh my gosh, dirty hands. I mean, right? Dirty hands, okay? I mean, the relationship with Hoover and so on and so forth. But yet there was a sense that, like, okay, this is the This is the world that we inhabit, and we make the best of our political alliances. We're not overly married to one political party. We hold our political identity lightly. We hold our Christian identity much more highly. We think like a minority. That means we're not purists, we're not doctrinaire. We take wins when we can get them. So I think all of that reflects what I see in today's religious liberty advocacy, where I tend to think that the best advocates for religious liberty are those that tend to come from a minority perspective. So I would say, like, I work all the time with Orthodox Jews. One of the best religious freedom lobbyists in the country is an Orthodox Jew, is a guy named Nathan Diamond. Many of you may know him. Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has it deep in their DNA that they are a religious minority. Generally, I think really good at advocating for religious liberty on their own behalf and on behalf of others, right? Seventh-day Adventists, for reasons of Saturday Sabbath, tend to be very effective. Black Christians, right, because of the history. I think that white evangelicals are probably the least effective, and I am a white evangelical, right? I'm both of those things. But like as a class, I think white evangelicals are less effective. I just think as a model of civic engagement, more white Christians should look to the history of the black church tradition of how to engage our political culture when you are in fact a minority, which white evangelicals now maybe sometimes feel like a majority, but their theological beliefs make them a cultural minority, okay? So that was my fourth point. Last, I predict that the black church is about to have higher engagement, and I'll tell you why. End of the year, fiscal year, ended June 30th, I wrote the board of First Amendment Partnership, and I wrote them about what are the emerging issues in religious freedom in the United States. And honestly, the biggest emerging issue is the intersection between faith and claims about gender identity, claims about what are the truths about gender. Should it be normative for us to have pronouns in our email, in our email addresses? Should it be normative to ask children at school what their pronouns are? Should it be normative, this is a live policy question, when kids decide that their pronouns are different from how they were presenting themselves last year, should parents be told or should that be concealed? A lot of this, 15 years ago, if you would have talked about these questions, we'd have said, oh, we're talking about something the Academy calls queer theory, was the idea in the Academy. Now that's not what we call it, but that's what we're talking about. We're talking about hotly disputed questions around gender and gender identity. And the thing is, those are making themselves more into schools and into public schools. And part of the issue is, this isn't just a religious liberty issue. It's not just a kind of right not to partake of this, although many parents are saying we don't want our children partaking in those particular discussions. But this is an issue that reaches into households, and the households want to teach their children about really core things. It's not so much at the institutional level. And of course, because Jim Crow, black church, sort of parachurch organizations don't exist at the same, in the same way. But we know that, everybody has kids. And I think that these questions around gender ideology, gender identity, I'm not even sort of betraying what I think about this here, but I'm saying this is the emerging issue. This is going to be a huge issue in the next 5 to 10 years. It is an issue on which people have deeply held commitments. And I think that there are going to be a lot of fireworks, even more than there are today. And I think that black parents, like Muslim parents, who for different reasons, but different but related reasons, Muslims are kind of underrepresented in the religious freedom discussions for some of those same coding reasons that I talked about earlier. They've kind of gotten involved in a lot of these conversations about gender ideology, gender identity. I think it's going to be the same with the black church. So I predict that you're going to see more discussion among black church leaders, among black Christians, in black institutions about these questions in the coming, 2 to 10 years. And I don't know how long it's going to take to work these things out, but I predict that that's going to be, you're going to see a lot more about that, and so start looking for it. Those are my points. I look forward to interacting with the rest of the panelists. And
thank you all so much for those very just thought-provoking points. I really appreciate the history. Bishop Daniels will have to keep in touch afterwards to delve deeper into the subject of civil rights, because that was very fascinating to see how that insertion of religion into the Civil Rights Act of 1964 shows up. I want to start, though, with the subject of language, Right, so Dr. Latimore, you bring up this distinction between liberty and freedom, and then Tim, you raised the issue of coding, and I think that's so important. When thinking about engaging the Black church, is that language, is it really that important to see this as a liberty issue versus a freedom, especially as Dr. Rivers said, a lot of Black people don't want to associate with religious liberty because of what's the coding issue here. So I want to pose this to the rest of the panel. Do you all agree? Is it important that in order to win over or to engage the African American church, as Dr. Latimore said, of course, it's not a monolith, but to engage those in the African American church, is it important to switch the language or to rework the language because it is very important when dealing with those coding issues? So I'll just pose that out.
So I should say we should probably ask Reverend Eugene Rivers to stand since we quoted his name a lot. But Reverend Eugene Rivers and I had a conversation over the last 6 months where we were struck by the fact that religious liberty as a conversation tends to have many of its cases and stories that are based on the experience of white Christians. And therefore, race is not a topic. If you look in the index, I'm not sure where you find race as a topic. So Reverend Rivers was saying, maybe we should let religious liberty continue along that trajectory and let religious freedom become the place, in my language, where the nexus between race and religious liberty is lodged. My presentation today would be a place that would illustrate that. But there's also other places. And if this is done, there would not only be the discussion of prohibitions and deprivations, not allowing the enslaved to worship, be Christian in some cases, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but also places where religious liberty has been expanded because of the role of race. And I just want to give the second illustration. One could be the Civil Rights Act 1964, but the other one is the Pennsylvania Supreme Court of 1816 that authorized the African Methodist Episcopal Church to exist. Prior to that, and all the court cases before that, it was unclear if African Americans had the same religious liberty rights as whites to run their own churches. And obviously their opponents said they did not, and therefore they should be under the control of the white Methodists. The judge, or judges, I'm not sure if the Supreme Court had more than one judge, I assume it did, but ruled that it did have the right. So, prior, religious liberty was one where race was not a factor except in deprivation and in prohibition. In this case, race expanded the notion of religious liberty. And that should be part of the history.
Anyone else want to address the
Just
language
to say
piece?
quickly, I think that the language issue is very important, but that it's important to get a hearing. You know, Tim talked about the fact that if he's talking to somebody who's progressive, he's not going to say, I work on religious liberty issues, because the shutters roll down. So I think it's important to get your foot in the door, the language that you use, but I think the concerns that you're raising are really key to whether you get any further than just your foot in the door. The focus on what are some of the issues that impact Black people, I think is going to be really important. So language only gets you so far.
You know, I would just add the rhetorical analysis of the religious liberties discussion is meaningful for the concepts it reveals. So alterations of rhetoric can only go so far if they never deal with the underlying ideas that they represent. And I think it is the underlying ideas that they represent that provides the dissonance between our engagement with this issue. So the rhetorical analysis is fine, but I think you got to get to the ideas that they represent.
No, they've said it well. I'm gonna sit that one out.
Okay. My question then next is for Dr. Rivers. I find it fascinating that you said in the study that I think white evangelicals were more racist, according to that index, than those in the general population. And also those who are likely to push forward religious liberty. And so there seems to be this cognitive dissonance between those who are pushing for liberty while at the same time holding these racist views. Why do you think such a tension or cognitive dissonance sort of exists within that population? And how does that impact how African Americans then view the religious liberty movement?
Well, I think that's a hard question to answer, but I think Christian nationalism is kind of the epitome of that. That there is this perception among white Christians that they are America. And therefore, for them, it's not, I don't think there is cognitive dissonance between seeking religious liberty and denying freedom. In fact, if you go back to the constitutions of the Carolinas, prior to that point, in British common law, Christians did not enslave other Christians. And so enslaved people who were coming from West Africa as Christians were claiming their freedom on the basis of their faith, because Christians don't enslave other Christians. They were also, enslaved people were also becoming Christians and saying, I'm now a Christian, I'm now your Christian brother, you can't enslave me any longer. And the constitutions of the Carolinas were written to make it explicit that enslaved people could not claim freedom. It would not affect their social status based on their religious commitment. So this is not cognitive dissonance. There is no dissonance in the mind of these people. As far as they're concerned, these things go together. White supremacy and Christianity in their minds are wedded, because it has always been that way in the United States. And what was the second part of your question?
I was going to say, how do you think that perception then, because if it's not a cognitive dissonance, but still that view impacts religious liberty or that push for religious liberty?
I think it absolutely alienates the black church. As I said, black people don't want to be associated with that for the most part. So I think we have to, I think it's really important for white Christians to begin a self-examination. And I don't mean just at the personal level, I mean at the institutional level, and think about what it means and how we change not just the language, but really the underlying ideas, so that the black church can, one, so that they can take a position for justice, and two, be more effective in bringing the black church in.
We'll have a chance for just one more question, then I guess I can open the floor for Q&A. I want to ask Dr. Latimore, you said kind of at the end of your presentation that our, meaning the African American church, theological thought must expand beyond ourselves if we're going to engage in this religious liberty, religious freedom. In what way should that be? In what way should we expand? What did you mean by that exactly?
Well, I think that all I'm trying to point to is that no religious group ought to perceive its praxis or its theological perceptions as normative for everyone.
Yeah.
Right? So there is always the need to be self-critical. And it's very easy in these kinds of conversations to so quickly fault the intellectual, conceptual, rhetorical deficiencies of others and never apply those same lenses to oneself. There are plenty of places and examples that, for those who've grown up in the black church, where you've seen the ways in which we've not allowed the exercise of religious liberties to all subgroups within the church. And so I think that kind of critical self-examination has to go alongside a communal examination of how we understand religious liberty and what its goals are. So that's what I mean. I never want the black church to get to the point that it perceives itself somehow exempt from examination.
Yeah.
Anyone else? I didn't know if you. I know I said one last question, but I just have one more question. Sorry for Tim. Take the moderator's privilege. You mentioned too in your presentation that minorities have the best perspective when it comes to religious liberty. Why do you think that is? And then how can, even though you said that white evangelicals are cultural minorities, they still are perceived as part of the majority. How can they learn from that and enact that as majorities?
So yeah, so I maybe need to amend my earlier statement because I don't want to say the best. I think I'm more saying the most effective. It best,
Sure.
kind of passes a moral judgment on it, and I'm making a prudential case as to why I think it's more effective. I just think that triumphalism just doesn't sell when you're trying to advocate for religious liberty, religious freedom, and I think that religious minorities tend to not have that as much. So I think that's why it's more effective. Where could white evangelicals learn? I think it's contact. I think that if white evangelicals had more contact with different strands of American religion, including different strands of Christianity, I think it would be helpful. I think there's a lot to learn, and that'd be my best advice.
Thank you so much. Now we'll open the floor. Dean Cole.
Yeah, so this was, I think, one of the best panels I've ever seen, and it was very informative for me. But one of the things I'm concerned about is disentanglement, and here's what I mean by that. This entire religious liberty initiative that I came up with here at Notre Dame was based on the history of my hero, Charles Hamilton Houston, who took down Plessy versus Ferguson. And he basically built a structure like what I've built here at Notre Dame, where he created a whole plan, including these kinds of summits, to bring together people and lawyers and ideas to attack separate but equal. And he succeeded with Brown versus Board of Education. But those meetings that he had with those lawyers all took place in a black church all around this country. And the reason why they took place in the black church is because the Ku Klux Klan, who were also one and the same with the police, wouldn't dare go into the black church to infiltrate those meetings. So those were the only places where we could have meetings to craft a strategy. And we're forgetting that history in part because of what Reverend Latimore and Dr. Rivers has said, essentially, which is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? We will not take the side of religious liberty because the very people who are oppressing people with religious liberty are the very people who oppress us. And so my question for you is, how do we disentangle that? Because we have to remember our history. We would not be here. I would not be here as a lawyer or as an educated person if it weren't for Charles Hamilton Houston. I literally would not have been able to go to school. And he wouldn't have succeeded if it weren't for the religious liberty of the black church. So how do we disentangle that for the black church?
See, I think that you are absolutely right, Dean Cole, that the black church has been central in providing still is central in places like Philadelphia. Ram Kanan went so far as to say that if the kind of work that churches did in providing support for the poor went away in Philadelphia, he thought it would result in massive social unrest. So religious freedom, because that's what people are doing. I'm doing a study, a much smaller study right now in Boston, and I'm asking pastors, why do you do this? Why do you serve the poor? And they're all saying, because of biblical teaching. People are acting on their faith. Tom Berg gave me the opportunity to write about this, and I called it enacted religious freedom. We don't talk in the black church about religious freedom. We act on our religious freedom. And that's just what you're describing. I think part of the challenge is we get a pass. The black church gets a pass. And so we're not with those white nationalists, right? Those Christian nationalists. We're doing something different, and we know we are not threatened. That is why I think the ball rests in lap of the white church who have to demonstrate they are for racial justice. I don't see any. We assume that we have the religious freedom. We assume that our churches will be a base for civil rights. We assume that it will be a place for voting rights. We assume it's a place where we can serve the poor. We assume that we are not going to come under scrutiny or attack. So we don't see the need to ally ourselves with the white churches. So I think the ball is in the court of the white churches. They have to be the ones who demonstrate that they recognize the confluence between justice and freedom.
So I'm an historian. I teach history of Christianity. And so I think the option would be, or one of the options, is to disentangle. The other option, sort of building on Crenshaw, is to come up with a category where you can show the intersectionality. And just as she was arguing, for black women, it wasn't either or. Am I a woman, which is based as a white woman's experience, or am I a victim that was based on a white man's experience? I need a new category in order to actually capture that I'm both. And maybe, so I think those are things we have to debate, but I think, I didn't realize that those clinics were held in a black church, so you've added another element to my class. I appreciate it.
That was good. That's a great question.
My name is Emil Harrison. For 25 years, I was at the Washington Post, covered most of these civil rights, and a professor at Howard University. But one of the things I appreciate that what the dean talked about, this tanglement, there needs to really be a glossary, because when you look at white evangelicals, that's a whole unique group that wasn't around 30 years ago, because I graduated from an evangelical school. But now you have that group, then you have the liberation theologists, which is a whole nother group, versus, so when you see religious freedom, freedom and liberation is two different things. And so my question is, we're on the edge of going up to Chicago for the conventions, and Republicans start on Monday, and the issue is, you have evangelical movement that's clashing with the traditional civil rights movement, and ironically, the people who really led those marches years ago with Dr. King were Catholics, the Methodists, and they were part of a different group. So now we have this spiritual gumbo going on, and I'm trying my best to write these stories, Religion Unplugged, and I'm like, Lord help us. And so where do you see the future going? Because somebody has to say, what we're going to do. I was so glad to see Dr. Rivers, because we were all part of the White House faith-based coalition under Bush and his father. And now I'm like, that's a different ball game 4 years ago. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and whatever you can see. But I appreciate what he said about the code, the changes. I'm like, where are we going, y'all? All right.
Anybody want to take that?
I'm just two quick comments about that I think just put a finer point on the great question. A lot of sociologists and scholars of religion have noted that many people are identifying themselves as evangelical who actually don't believe anything evangelical theologically, that evangelical is increasingly becoming a political term rather than a theological term. Right. The other thing is that this is perplexing scholars, but the single characteristic most predicting whether a black American will identify as a Republican, does anybody know what it is right now? It is lack of church attendance. The more likely you attend church, the more likely you are to not identify, but the people who are the more secular, and that is the single greatest predictor of whether a black American right now will identify as a Republican. And that's a little confounding, because it's completely, it's one of those things that hits you and you're like.
It's the opposite in the white community. The more likely
Right.
you are to be church affiliated, the more likely you are to
Yep.
be Republican.
Yep. Anyway, just food for thought.
Yes. Thank you so much for your presentations. Because I work for the BJC, I had to self-identify in that moment because I think it is important to raise awareness about that issue that happened with the BJC and the changing around, going from public affairs, which is significant for communities of color to think about public affairs issues that point back to our freedom versus looking at religious liberty, which then limits the issues, how issues are looked at that impact our communities. And so to that point, I agree with you, Dr. Rivers, that it is important that the white church takes on this issue and that also the white church puts itself in a position and a posture of listening and understanding the experiences of not just Black Christians, but Black people in America, because the issues that impact our lives are not just limited to our religious identities, because they see us as they see us, right? The other thing that I want to raise is I appreciate, and so to that I will say that people need to be aware about the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign, which is critically important because Christians are taking a stand, but there is more work that needs to be done, which then points to what Dr. Latimore, Reverend Latimore, was saying, because you talked about the distinction, and I've said this earlier too, about the distinction between religious liberty and religious freedom, because freedom is critically important for us in terms of our agency and power as human beings. With that stated, I'm curious to know how any of you are really talking about this in your personal context to help make the connection for those in the Black community that don't talk about religious freedom or understand religious freedom, to see how Christian nationalism is having an impact on our personal lives, or how religious freedom is being used in ways that is actually a weapon. Because when you said religious freedom, my question is always, whose religious freedom?
So I think that's excellent point. Whose religious freedom? The story I told about what happened with the constitutions of the Carolinas made it clear that these were also the constitutions that implemented religious freedom, right? So it's clear it's religious freedom for some, but not for all. Very good point. Most of my work is really in terms of writing about religious freedom and doing conferences like this. Not so much on the ground. Interesting challenge, something for me to think about.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, the question that you asked, and actually the last three questions are incredibly powerful and linked, because it speaks to really the conundrum that the Black church sits in. Because there are lots of questions around identity and purpose and meaning. You talked about the pastors opening up their doors for these communal meetings and how critical that was. And that's operating at a time when their identity as churches are formed in such a way that they perceive an obligation to do that kind of work. And one might argue that that kind of self-awareness or self-examination may not exist in that way at this moment, and that there may be other motivators. Now, I spent the first 15 years of my career in investment management, so I am deeply beholden to economic thinking, and I think that there are, what we're seeing are some of the residuals of a particular economic system that are reshaping our identities, both institutionally and individually, and are creating some of the needs for disentanglement that you point to, the needs to really examine what and who gets to determine freedom, and what and how do we pursue it, and how does this question around religious liberty fit into that discussion. These are all unopened questions, and oftentimes, because the economic system tends to be ahistorical, we think that we have to create a solution today with no reference to what happened yesterday, instead of mining yesterday for its wisdom but not being beholden to it. So I think there are just a number of dynamics that are at work that'll make your questions relevant, but also make them challenging for the practitioner who's trying to figure their way forward.
And I just want to say, I would be remiss if I don't say that the BJC has been working towards addressing that issue, because there is the development of the Project on Race and Religious Freedom, which I lead, which falls under the BJC.
Yes, I did mean to acknowledge that the BJC is in a different place today than it was. So thank you for flagging that.
Good, yeah.
First, I want to thank you, Dean, for hosting and facilitating this conversation. I just want to thank you for that. It's extremely important. And given where the country is politically, how we move forward, the faith communities, is now politically more important than probably any other political conversation because the country's going nuts. Question, how might one deepen this conversation? Because I was here at one of the conferences and I went into the book display area. And there was a book on, written by a Notre Dame scholar.
Not this one.
No.
Professor Munoz.
No, it was a scholar on religious liberty and the American experience, sort of a history of religious liberty and American experience. And my wife will, so the first thing I did, I looked at the table of contents and I flipped to the back. I said, okay, we're talking about religious liberty, right? So I'm gonna see what we're gonna talk about. So, and the guy's a faculty person here. Y'all can talk about it, whoever he is later. So I go to the back of the book. See, the history of the United States, liberty, it was not one word said about slavery. And I said, I know I misread that. So I go back, contents, flip through the book, go back. And the last time I was here, and I thought about that thing, and that thing bothered me. I mean, I said, how are you going to have a conversation around religion? And it's, how can you publish a book on this and the history of the United States, of all countries on the planet Earth, and ignore slavery? And there was the word freedom was never even mentioned. And see, some of y'all know, I got a thing about this, right? Yes. I got a thing. We were in London. I got into a thing with people about this. I said, now, how does this work intellectually? I'm from North Philly, so I'm not that bright, but I understand. And so my point is there any possibility that there could be, on this issue, some intellectual engagement? So I go back to home. I'm rummaging through too many books. Philip Foner has a book. It's not Philip Foner. Who's there? Eric Foner. Freedom. And there are like a half a dozen books on freedom. Orlando Patterson had a big old fat book, Freedom, 800 pages. My suggestion to the Christians is this: could there be, in some context, the next iteration of this conversation where there's an intellectual engagement around the issue of freedom, which, as a concept, with this remarkable body of literature, eliminated from the discussion of liberty? So you write out slavery, the slaves, and we're talking about liberty, to the good pastor doctor's point. So I'm asking, because right now, as the country descends into what it's descending into as we speak, Dean, what you're doing here is going to have more moral, political, and theological importance as the country completely partitions off in separate directions. Mm-hmm. Eric Foner, Freedom, there are a series of texts that are central, connected to liberty. And last thing, Fannie Lou Hamer, a plea. One of the most powerful advocates for religious freedom in the history of the United States. In fact, the most powerful, Fannie Lou Hamer, right? Descendant of slaves, right? The leader of the freedom movement in Mississippi, right? There is no more powerful example. She is brutalized by these people down south, raped, violated, maintained her Christian conviction to the end. None of the religious liberty people anywhere have talked about the unbelievable example of Fannie Lou Hamer. So she's telling me to dial it down.
Yes, yes.
I'm gonna take my medication.
And say, we're planning to do a conference on
Okay,
Fannie
so, but I just
Lou
want to
and religious
suggest,
freedom.
Since we're into liberty, we might consider freedom. And in that context, look at the spiritual, and she's a Christian, right? Fannie Lou Hamer. Enough said. Okay. I'm gonna breathe in, breathe out. Okay, I got it.
I would just add, too, that you want to include Harriet Tubman, because she was also a strong woman of faith. You're talking about freedom and religious liberty.
Absolutely.
I mean, she was like a prophet in the biblical sense, yes.
I think I should let you all respond to that before I ask my question, right?
I think that was a statement. I don't think that was a question.
Well, I do have to say that when Reverend Rivers tells you he's not very bright, grab your wallets. Sorry, this isn't my question, but I will just tell you a little bit of good news. Shameless plug, Reverend Rivers, but Professor Kurt Lash and I have a draft article right now where we write about this, one of the single most important historical events that teaches us about the meaning of the Free Exercise Clause around the Reconstruction era was religious resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act and heroes like Harriet Tubman.
Wonderful.
And the Reconstruction era Congress referred to that resistance when they articulated a robust protection of religious exercise. And so your experience makes it possible so that all of us can have that protection. A question I have for you that will have both a negative element and then hopefully a positive element is I have noticed that when religious people who do not often or are less frequently lining up politically hear about religious exercise of someone else, it's easier for them to chalk those religious beliefs up to just a political view. So like in the Oak Flat case that we've been involved in, where Native Americans are protecting their sacred site, I have heard some Christian groups say, well, it's really like environmental political movement, right? And I've also heard some views about black church opposition to the Johnson Amendment, that it's like, well, you just want to be able to talk about politics, that's not religion. I think they can't really see the way in which those are often interrelated. And then, of course, criticism sometimes of conservative Christian groups with things like the contraceptive mandate litigation was like, well, you're just politically opposed to abortion, and so this is just sort of a Trojan horse for you to do that. And so do you think that that's a problem? I guess, is that something you've observed where maybe white Christian groups are less likely to understand the ways in which, sure, sometimes religious beliefs and politics line up, but that doesn't mean there's not a core religious belief there. How do we do better at translating those religious beliefs? Is the key there something related to what Tom's been talking to us about, to give more benefit of the doubt to those that we may see politics differently about, but we can give more charity to their religious beliefs?
So I have to say, I wasn't aware of that. You know, this idea that the religious beliefs and commitments of other people are being reframed as political positions by others who are coming from a different religious tradition. But I think, and so I'm not sure how to answer, but it strikes me that this comes back to Tom Edsol's point, that everything is becoming politicized. So that what is really a religious commitment is being recast as a political position precisely because right now we politicize everything. And I really want to think about that, Stephanie. How do we push back against that? Because I don't have any immediate thoughts other than working on the larger problem of polarization, I think, might reduce the tendency to try to politicize people's religious positions.
Hey, Professor, I think that what you're observing is absolutely a correct observation about, people doubting or just thinking that these are just extensions over politics. And a lot of that is for the reasons I said, right? People are identifying as evangelical, not because they hold to evangelical theology classically understood, but because they're identifying with a certain political movement. So there's like all of these suspicions like have a root in truth, right? So I think the best way to rebut that is to show that your religious commitments are comprehensive and they don't always lead you to the political answer of one party. So I think if you know what I mean, if you show your fuller religious self and not just your religious self in this single religious dispute that has a legal element to it, but you show your broader set of religious commitments as not just being about a particular political outcome, that gives you a stronger rebuttal. But if your religious commitments always seem to land on, gosh, this just totally syncs up with the Republican Party platform, like, what are the odds? I mean, I guess it just happened, you know, or vice versa. Then I think that then people are going to suspect you of being, of kind of just, using religious freedom as a way of just getting your political way through a different means.
And I think that that's really a good point, Tim. And that, unfortunately, I think that's also a challenge we have to bring to the churches. To say that whether you are Republican or Democrat, as a Christian, your commitments are to what Christ teaches, not to the platform of the Democratic Party or the platform of the Republican Party. I think, unfortunately, in many cases, we are just subsuming our Christian commitments or our religious commitments, for those who aren't Christian, subsuming our commitments to political platforms.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. I want to thank you so much for a great, robust conversation. I learned so much, and I think for myself, looking at the concept of religious liberty or religious freedom, and connecting that to coming to the U.S. as a religious minority, as a refugee child, that it would be remiss of me to not mention the fact that the civil rights movement played a huge role for people like myself to come to this country. And the idea of advocacy plays a huge role in that. And I always say that if your advocacy is only for the people that look like you or pray like you, then there's something wrong with your advocacy, because it should be inclusive of all people. In that the religious work that we all do is a huge component of that. And connecting that back to the civil rights movement, which prompted the immigration movement in the US. Prior to that, the US was only taking mostly Europeans into the US. But then when the Immigration Act came as a result of the civil rights movement, people like myself were able to come to the US, right? And that is on the backs and the works of the civil rights movement and everybody who did that work. So moving that along and recognizing that, I think, is so important for us to look back at what history did for not just for the Black community, but how that was an extension out to everybody else. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Yes, and I appreciate that, that civil rights advocates were not simply advocating for themselves, that in fact they were advocating for freedom and rights for all. Very good point.
Thank you. We have time for, I think, one more question. So.
Thank you. So, wonderful panel. Thank you. Ask a little bit about how you might characterize the challenge to the Catholic Church. Here we have a remarkable initiative at Notre Dame, coming significantly out of Marcus's life and the inspiration of a set of nuns in San Mateo, California, as we heard the other night. Catholic Church has been, maybe the record is mixed on this, and it depends on what you're talking about. But I was struck as as several of you were talking about the way the church has framed the religious freedom question here is freedom to serve, which sounds very much like Dr. Latimore, what is freedom for, right? And so I wonder if you see overlap there, and sort of what is the challenge to the Catholic Church?
Anyone want to take that?
Go ahead. Dr. Latimore, you want to
Yeah,
say?
I will only say I'm influenced by Brian Massengale's work, examining the history of the Catholic Church as it relates to issues of race. And so I would certainly offer as a starting point, it's not a maybe. The record of the Catholic Church is indeed mixed. There have been both things that are laudatory and things that are troubling around the Catholic Church. And I think the Catholic Church faces challenges similar to the other religious communities. that there is an attempt, one, to make sure that rhetoric becomes reality. So there are several statements from the Catholic Church around issues of race. And when in Mass Gill's work, he examines the outcomes of that, is certainly mixed. So how do we do a better job of concretizing our belief systems in our actual praxis? Secondly, the Catholic Church also has informed a lot of religious communities through Catholic social teaching and some of its commitments, and certainly our brothers in Latin America and their work in liberation theology. They have also played an important role of informing, deepening, and expanding our thought. So I just think that the Catholic Church has to do the same work the rest of us are doing, that we don't rely on the successes of the past, we don't remain handicapped, to the deficiencies of the past, but we pull from the richness of our tradition and see how might they be applied afresh in the contemporary moment.
Excuse me, just on the Catholic thing, one of the things that has to be said, and I really feel the need to say this because I'm in a Catholic house, and we would be remiss if we didn't salute. During the Civil Rights Movement, Selma and other major initiatives, Catholic priests and nuns put their bodies on the line. Part of the problem is that people have forgotten their own history.
Sure.
King, the Catholics, the Catholic students, the women religious were very active. There were folk that were, violence was committed against them. And so that's a chapter that's lost in most folk born, more recently. And so there are a number of instances in the movement where the Catholic, the young Catholics, nuns, women religious, played major roles in the Deep South, reaching out. Just want to wrap that.
Thank you. And with that, I think that
Tim was going to.
Oh, sorry, I apologize. I didn't.
Gosh, no, I was going to say that, one of the challenges we have in advocating for religious freedom for people of all faiths is that the role of religion, institutional religion, has suffered a decline in sort of public respect, right? In the old days, in the 1950s, if you watched a movie and you saw a Catholic priest, he was going to be good. He was going to be portrayed as good. Now, if you're on CSI and there's a Catholic priest introduced in Act 1, he probably is the guy who did it in Act 3, right? And so that's just emblematic of a decline of respect for institutional religion. And
Because if it's a black pastor, they're going to do the same thing.
exactly.
Right.
But I mean, so some of this just is because of the church abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, but that is mirrored in Southern Baptist. We have it in Anglicanism. I mean, it's everywhere, but you have institutional religion doing bad things in the name of God. Mm-hmm. That is a drag on the perception of religious freedom being a good thing, because you're asking, well, what's the good for if it's for this, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's something that we have to all kind of reckon with. But I'm really glad that the good things are happening here at Notre Dame, because I view it as one of the brightest spots, not just in the Catholic world, but in all of the religious freedom world. The work that is happening here at Notre Dame under Dean Cole is an absolute bright spot, and may there be 1,000 more things like this.
Amen.
All right. Thank you so much.
Well, I'll be very brief, but I just want to thank this fantastic panel. That was a really important conversation, one the likes of which we need to hear more, especially white Christian communities. And we need to think about ways that we can be better allies for the important work that you all are doing. So thank you. And I do just want, can we give one more round of applause to Dean Cole, without whom none of these conversations would be possible? So, you all have made this my favorite Religious Liberty Initiative Summit yet. The conversations have been phenomenal. You also made me cry more than I ever have in a professional setting, so thank you. This has been really meaningful. And now we'll turn it over to Dean Cole.
Thank you, Stephanie, and I want to personally thank all of you on this panel. You were amazing. This is one of my favorite panels that I've ever seen in my academic career. I do want to, before I give any concluding remarks, I just want to make a few comments on the point that Dr. Eugene Rivers just made. I gave a speech several years ago that has wound up getting published in several different places. But one of the points that I made was that during the Freedom Rides, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, who were killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi, people forget that Goodman and Schwerner were Jews, right? Only Cheney was African American. Goodman and Schwerner were not fighting for their own right to vote. They were fighting for mine. And we don't see those kinds of coalitions anymore among religious groups. And part of my hope, part of the hope for me that comes from the work of Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall and the lawyers who came before me, is that we will start to form those kinds of coalitions that can affect change. And so I'm grateful that, for all of you who participate in this event. And it means a lot to me that you all come and traveled from all around the world to be here for this. And I hope that you'll join us in Dublin next year. But I would be remiss if I didn't thank our team here at Notre Dame. And so I just want to make sure that I just bring their names to your attention, starting with John Meeser, who is the faculty director of our clinic. John is our clinical professor of law who oversees our entire legal clinic. He's a brilliant lawyer, and he has brought a mind for strategy and an understanding of ecumenicalism to this work that makes him a unique treasure for us. I also want to thank the lawyers who work with him, Meredith Holland Kessler, Brendan Wilson, who runs our transactional clinic, and Francesca Matozzo, as well as Kimberly Orr, our receptionist, Laura Snedecki, Ariane Kalingo, who handles our communications, Denise Wager, I wrote down the wrong list of names here, so I'm trying to remember them off the top of my head now. I can't forget Mia Tawana, who essentially organized this entire conference, and our events team led by Lisa Driver and Tanya Robinson, and Adrienne Galicia. Am I forgetting anyone? I'm forgetting my partner in crime, Stephanie Barclay, who 4 years ago believed me when I said we could do this, and she came here, and she dropped everything after a lunch meeting in Provo, Utah, and decided to come out here to help build this religious liberty initiative. And none of what you see here would have been possible without her buying into this vision and putting her shoulder to the wheel and using all of her talents. I tell everyone she's a unicorn because she truly is. She's one of the world's greatest litigators. She's also a brilliant scholar. She earned tenure here at Notre Dame in record time, then went off to be a clerk on the Supreme Court of the United States for Justice Gorsuch. Is also working on her Doctor of Philosophy at Oxford University. It's amazing what she does, and I don't know if there's anything she can't do. And so I just want to give her a round of applause. And anybody who knows me knows that I could not do a thing. I'm an example of God using an empty vessel to accomplish a lot. And I could not do a thing if it weren't for the fact that God gave me this woman, Angela Cole. we celebrated our 37th wedding anniversary last week, and didn't take her anywhere because we had to do this. So I'm grateful for her generosity in that way as well. So with that, I want to thank you. I want to thank all of you who've participated in this conference. And again, I appreciate. I'm passionate about this because you're passionate about this. I think that this is important to us and to the whole world. And I appreciate that you buy into this effort, that you're all doing your part. And I'm here to help in any way I can in all of the various fights that you're engaged in. And it's my hope that we'll all gather together again in Dublin next year. So thank you for being here.